morning, everybody. Not only am I sending a hello to my colleague David at UJA and our friend Donna in Philly, we're also saying hi to our friend Stephanie Gary, who is in Zanzibar, bringing us all to the most interesting place perhaps we've been so far as a community. Anywhere you are, when you tune in to our morning Torah broadcast, we are all with you. And so we've been to some exciting places. Daily, we've been with Catherine in Australia. Often we're with Fabrice in Paris. Recently, we've been with our friends Linda and Debbie in Israel. It's amazing. It's amazing, friends. Think about what the there in our sentences mean today. Given that we are re-entering the world and actually in places which is so holy, it is so good to be alive. It is so good to mindfully and safely rejoin each other out in the world, sharing experiences, touching shoulders, giving each other hugs with consent, which is something that we are experimenting with again. Whenever you see people, I was teaching a class in person, one of the first ones in person with one of the groups I lead for UJA. We wanted to see each other so badly. Some of us were wearing masks, some of us weren't. Two members of our group were cautious because of a simcha coming up, and so they were distant, and so we are finding our way. But a whole bunch of people said, are we hugging? And we asked permission, and then we hugged. And I was struck by the sanctity of that interchange. We asked, are we hugging? Because then that hug was so much more precious. It was offered with love and respect. It was received with love and respect. There are ways that we are going to continue experimenting with our relationships so that we can be gentle and respectful and ask, just ask. That's something that I think we have learned. So may we be blessed to not forget the lesson of consent as we reapproach each other in physical space. It's really going to be important for us to think about. Let's look at this week's Parsha, because it is also true that when we look back at the experience of having been B'midbar, really in the desert of this pandemic for 2.5 years plus now, and please God, our health only increases. How do we tell the story of where we've been? Generations to come will know what we went through, but will they know everything that we mean to share? Will they hear in their histories the actual experiences? Will we remember, when we tell the story of the last 2.5 years, to talk about the almost interrupted transfer of power in the American presidency? Will they remember the murder of George Floyd and the rallies afterwards that brought people who had never acted for civil rights and racial justice out into the world to do so? Will they look at the transferring of names, instead of celebrating generals who fought to keep people enslaved, switching those names on federal and national and state monuments to names of those who fought for freedom and dignity for all? Will we remember the essential workers, like people who stock the shelves in grocery stores? Will we remember all the therapists who worked harder than ever to help us keep our minds and our hearts whole? Will we remember the doctors and scientists who fought against disinformation and viruses? Will we remember what it was to need each other so much, to cry just to be together? Will we remember how synagogues and churches and mosques turned digital platforms into sanctuaries? Will we remember all the things that we were afraid we would never have again, so that we never take them for granted? What will our children hear from us as we tell these stories? I've edited a number of books during the time of the pandemic, a 2-volume collection I've begun to return to called When We Turned Within, with hundreds of voices that we assembled from around the world reflecting on the experience of COVID. A colleague of mine, a dear friend, shared with me a story in another book that I edited called Honey from the Rock, which was all rabbinic reflections. He lost his father during COVID. His father's a rabbi. His father lived in Israel and caught COVID leading a Kaddish minyan in a nursing home in Israel. Will we remember? Will we remember in a positive story a mother who wrote of her son's bar mitzvah, which because of COVID took place on Zoom. But because her son has autism, that was the best bar mitzvah he could have possibly imagined, because he could regulate the interchange. He could be in the experience and moderate it himself. It was the perfect Zoom mitzvah, she said. Will we remember our religious leaders and teachers who struggled mightily and transcended limitations, holding up communities and now rebuilding them? Will we remember that sitting in your living room and streaming into a sanctuary while luxurious is not the goal? Will we show up in shuls again? There are so many stories. We call this testimony. We tell our histories, one generation to the next. What will we remember? Now, why am I sharing this right now? Number one, because we must and should, and it's appropriate. And we need to take the time to grieve. My wife and I were watching a wonderful comedian last night who, through humor, was pointing to so much of what we've been through. Wearing masks and smelling your own breath was actually a phenomenal way of acknowledging how long we wore masks and didn't see each other's faces. The bravery of shopping for food for our children. I remember. In this week's Parsha, Moshe, who has been saying goodbye now for 26 chapters so far in the book of Deuteronomy, tells us what to do when we finally arrive at the destination we've been trying to reach. We call it the Promised Land, but you and I have sincere notions of what that destination could be called. For a long time we called that vaccination. We called that a booster. We called that the pursuit of truth in the face of disinformation so that our neighbors would choose life, because if they didn't, they would be at risk, and so would everyone else. That promised land, as Stephanie just wrote, the promise land, a place where the promises we've made come true. Halavai, please God, may our children and our children's children feel themselves closer to the promise than we have felt these last 2.5 years. There have been moments of radical wonder. Amanda Gorman's voice. So much art. New forms of music created by artists like my wife, who found ways of turning screens into heart portals, recreating their classics, finding new ways of performing, teaching from a place of vulnerability, and singing their souls out. I admire my wife so much for her bravery, courage, and artistry during this time, and so many other champions of soul. Moses' goodbye begins with telling a story. When you arrive, ki tavo el haaretz, asher Adonai Elohecha noten lecha nachala. When you arrive at the promised land that God has promised you as an inheritance, virishta, you will inherit it, v'yashavta ba, and you will settle there. You will settle there. That's all we ever wanted, right? To settle, to be calm. I've been teaching the words of Theodore Herzl recently. And in one of his pitches in 1897, or 1896, to create the State of Israel, he was speaking to the community about finally having a plot of land where we can live, and then he says, where we can live and die in our own homes. That doesn't sound like the pitch we ever thought would resonate. But vishavta, to just settle, this is my home. This is where I live. This is the dignity of life that my ancestors wished for me and that I wish for my descendants. Moses then continues by saying the first thing you'll do is when you plant crops, the first of the harvest, the bikurim, you will bring, and then you will recite a formula, Arami Oved Avi. My ancestor was a wandering Aramaean. That's the story of Avraham and Sarah. They wandered. This nomadic life was our people's story. And then it continues. I want you to listen to what is spoken in this formula that we are told to recite by Moses when we bring the bikurim, when we bring the first fruits. An Aramaean Ashrei was my ancestor. He went down to Egypt and sojourned there as few in number, but he became there a nation, great, mighty in number. Okay, first of all, that skips all of the book of Genesis. All the story of Joseph, the story of Dinah, everything is missing except Avraham, Egypt. Now the Egyptians dealt ill with us and afflicted us and placed us in hard servitude. So we cried out to God, the God of our ancestors, and God heard our voice. What happened to the 400 years in Egypt, including 290 years of slavery? Somehow in the history telling that Moses is giving us in this moment, it's missing. There's something missing. History. Where is the texture of history? Where's the fullness of our story? So we cried out to God, and God heard our voice, saw our affliction, our strain, our oppression. We know this Hebrew because we recited every Passover, every Pesach. Vayaret onyenu vet amalenu vet lachatzenu. We say this. And God took us out from Egypt with a strong hand, with outstretched arm, with awe-inspiring acts and signs and portents. And God brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Again, what's missing? 40 years. Not only the 290 years of slavery, total of 400 years in Egypt, but also the 40 years in the desert. What happened to Sinai? What happened? So I want to be gentle with our ancestor, loving to Moses, and cautious as the living generation of spiritual inheritors, you and me. We have the chance right now, because it is fresh in our memory. It is placed in our hearts in indelible ways. During this broadcast, I've shared many more memories than I thought I would, because once you start sharing, it's hard to stop. Once you start remembering, especially a long, difficult time, it will be hard to stop. But that doesn't mean that the right thing to do is abstain from starting. Remember the teaching in Pirkei Avot, Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor. Creative acts are not yours to complete, v'lo ata ben chorin lihibatel mimena, and you are not free from starting. So for the sake of your own heart's healing, and for the sake of documenting this history, for the sake of teaching our children, warning them the prices of racial injustice, the cost of untended democratic institutions, the cost of disinformation and mistrust of science. For the sake of the future, friends, how will you tell our story? As Lin-Manuel Miranda put it so elegantly in Hamilton, history has its eyes on us. Moses knew that. I think we know that. We have to do something with that knowledge. Pass it on. Tell our story in its fullness. And so the only thing to do is to get started. When Rosh Hashanah comes in just 2 weeks, we will stand together, please God, physically, safely together, before the Creator of the universe and ask for a new year. Be grateful for every breath. And we will sing B'Rosh Hashanah Yikatevun. On Rosh Hashanah it is written, B'Yom Tzom Kippur Techatemun. And on Yom Kippur it is sealed. I want to say something about that last part and then wish us a good day. It's never sealed for good. We can keep writing. That's the gift that God has given us. You can be the author of your next day. And if we write it carefully, our children will learn that history well enough to hopefully avoid some of the mistakes that we have made, to appreciate how hard we have worked to reach this moment, so that every time they say Shehechianu, we are alive. They will know never to take it for granted. They will know that we didn't take it for granted. They will know that we have mourned those we have lost. We have stood in solidarity with life, and we championed it enough to labor for it in the public sector. We have work ahead, friends, to preserve the memory of all that we have lost and to write a better chapter with our children. So bless you, friends. It's a heavy lesson today, but it's also the right one with which to prepare for a new year. So let's have one more moment of song, sing our way into a good day. Here we go. Bless you all, friends. See you tomorrow.